Hello again, A-level geographers. Welcome to another NEA session, this time focusing on the conclusions and critical evaluation section of your NEA. So you're nearing the end of your NEA write-up now, and this section is one of the most important sections of your entire NEA. On the Edexcel course for A-level, this section is worth 24 marks out of 70. So it's a good bulk of those marks for the total NEA. And that means it is a section you need to focus on intently, and you need to make sure you get it right. So I'm going to run through, first of all, a checklist of the things that should be in your conclusions and critical evaluation. You should be aware of some of these already, as you will have gone through them in lesson. And I've split it into conclusion and evaluation on screen for you. Now, the word count for this, again, don't really worry about word count, but it's going to be 1,200 words-ish. So, for a conclusion, you should be answering each of your key questions or hypotheses. It should be a synthesis of the evidence you found out. Now, a synthesis is not just a summary. It's where you bring all of the information for that key question together and answer that key question or hypothesis. You should try and link back and quote geographical theory from your introduction and your analysis. You should try and use the data you have gathered to prove or disprove your arguments. You should not put anything new in a conclusion. It should be evidence that you have used in your analysis. And finally, at the end of your 3 different key question or hypothesis conclusions, you should have a summary of main findings section. And this brings all of those 3 different conclusions together to leave a lasting impression on the reader or the examiner, telling them exactly what you have found out about your whole investigation overall. What is the answer to the question you set out with from the beginning? So that's your conclusion. Now, evaluation is the part of the NEA that most students find the most difficult. Yet, if you follow some simple structures and guidance, you should be able to achieve high level 3 or level 4 marks in it. So the evaluation is about evaluating the methods, the sampling, the locations you used, the timing and frequency of your methods, the depth you went into, the use of the sources you've used, secondary and primary, and further research you could do. So you're looking at what went well and what you were able to find out reliably and what did not go so well. So you're going to include a number of sections in your evaluation. One of them will be called validity and reliability of the investigation. And that will explore from you how reliable your investigation is and how valid your conclusions are based on the data you gained. You will also have a wider context section, and this is where you explore possible further research and who might be interested in the investigation you've carried out. Who does it affect? Who might be worth looking at it? And finally, you also consider your ethical dimensions from earlier on in the methodology, and you say whether they were good enough and whether or not they met your criteria for the investigation. So that's just a roundup of the main things that go into a conclusion and an evaluation. So let's go through conclusion in a bit more detail. And what I've put together here for you is just a brief structure as to how your conclusion should look. So as you can see, you've got key question 1 or hypothesis 1, 2, and 3, and then summary of main findings on the right. Each of your key question or hypotheses paragraphs should follow a structure. So there should be a brief summary of what the aim was. What did you want to find out with this key question? Then a good peel paragraph of what you did find out using the data from your analysis. Then trying to link back to geographical theory where relevant. And then at the end of each of the hypotheses or key question paragraphs saying, overall, what the answer to that key question or hypothesis was based on your analysis and summary. Now, you do that effectively 3 times. And then, when you have done your 3 little conclusions for each of the key questions or hypotheses, you come to do a summary of findings. Now, this is a separate section in the conclusion, and this is where you bring everything together from these 3 key questions or hypotheses. So this is solely focused on answering the overall investigation title. This is where you bring everything together to answer that question. And you try to leave a lasting impression on the reader that answers your question. So the reader is very aware of what you have carried out and what the answer to the investigation was. A lot of teachers and examiners read the summary of findings and the whole conclusion first when reading an NEA. Because if the examiner or teacher can figure out what you did in your investigation and what you found out, that generally suggests that the NEA will be of good quality overall. So it needs to be very explicit in what you found out and what your basis is for those arguments. So I'm just going to take you through now some examples of conclusions from past students. And I focused on one example in particular to show you how they have concluded from their question. So this student's question was, to what degree do people's perceptions of Crossrail vary between Southall and Finsbury Park? So you can see that the start of this student's conclusion just outlines what Crossrail is, how they conducted their surveys, and what the final conclusions may be. And they've also brought in theory. So this kind of opens up the conclusion. And it says what the conclusions will consider going forward. So what are they going to look at next? And then the student goes into their first key question. So their first key question was, are commuters and people that live in Crossrail areas more likely to believe that the project is worthwhile? So as you can see then, this student has started straight away to answer this question by saying what their data said from their surveys. And they've gone through the opinion of people. It mentions that there could be bias between the 2 surveys that were carried out. And it generally explains really well what overall the investigation has found in relation to these commuters and people's beliefs on this project. And you can see at the end, the student goes back to the question and says, overall, there is a large degree of variation, or there is not a large degree of variation between both of the areas. So the student has formed a really good paragraph here. There's lots of evidence. There is good examples, and it links straight back to the key question they set out with. Key question 2, what do people believe are the potential benefits and drawbacks of Crossrail? And how do these perceptions vary by location? So this one is looking at advantages and disadvantages of the Crossrail project. So the student says people were asked about these. The student also says that there was a mode involved, in other words, a commonality involved in both locations, people mentioning ease of congestion. Also, people mentioning the idea of areas becoming more trendy because of it and the impacts of, for example, wealth. You can see the student also links it to Myrtle's model of cumulative causation. And you can see that the student also says journeys are becoming cheaper. Journeys might become cheaper because of multiple rail providers, etc. So this student again also relates to the figures of their data presentation in their analysis. As you can see there, figure 4.4.1 and 4.5.1. And that is showing that the student has thought in detail about the data that will be useful to answering this question about perceptions on benefits and drawbacks. The student's third question, as you can see again, is are house prices rising in Southall? And is this a consequence of people's perceptions of Crossrail? So the student is trying to link people's perceptions of the Crossrail project with rising house prices. The student says that perceptions are important because it affects what people do. And the student says that their data has found that it is causing a bit of a localized inflation in house prices. The student then goes through some data that proves that from their investigation, brings in the model again that they mentioned for key question 2, and says that that provides some proof that this can happen in places. And finally, the student then disputes the links that can be made between perceptions and house prices. The student actually also says, on the other hand, it might not be the case that there is a link, and it might just be that the house prices are rising because the rest of London's house prices are rising. So, as you can see, the student has really in depth here thought about what the question was, what the answer to that question is, what the data shows to answer that question, and whether there's anything else outside of their investigation that actually may explain it as well. And finally, then, you need a summary of findings as mentioned earlier. And the summary of findings basically takes all those 3 previous paragraphs, puts it into one, and answers the overall question title. So remember, the student wanted to find out to what degree do people's perceptions of Crossrail vary between Southall and Finsbury Park. And the student here starts talking about the differences in people in Crossrail, with Southall interviewees being more personal in benefits, and then compares that to Finsbury Park, where the student has found they think more positively. Then the student also goes through again the perceptions of benefits and drawbacks. And essentially, the student is aiming with this summary of findings just to take everything they've said, bring it together in a simple format, and actually answer the question they set out with. So that is overall what you do in your conclusion section of your NEA. Now let's move on to evaluation. So evaluation has 4 main strands, and it's critical that you use these strands as titles in your evaluation to make sure you are hitting the level 4 mark bands that you can. So we've got data reliability, validity of conclusions, ethical considerations, and wider significance. Now, data reliability will make up the bulk of your evaluation. And what you are doing here is thinking about your sampling methods and whether or not they were accurate, what were the strengths and weaknesses of them, and could they have been influenced by bias. You're looking at the factors in collecting your data that could have impacted on how valid they were. So were you accurate? Did you follow the sampling correctly? Were you in the right locations? What time of day was it? And so on. And finally, you're considering whether there could have been any more data you could have collected differently that would have benefited the investigation, not just for the sake of more data, but that would have actually given you something of an advantage that you could use to further strengthen your conclusion. The second section is the validity of the conclusions. Now that relates to the first section in that you're thinking about how valid your conclusions are. Could the method errors or the weaknesses you've pointed out beforehand affected or could have affected those conclusions? Is the amount of data collected enough to be able to reliably conclude? And so what you're doing here is thinking about all of the errors and weaknesses and strengths and whether or not your conclusions are actually valid, therefore, and explaining why they are or why they are not. Ethical considerations is a brief section here, but what you need to do is think back to your methodology, and you would have put in your methodology some ethical considerations as to how you were going to carry out your methods. You now need to consider whether those ethical considerations were valid, were accurate, and helped you gain the data you needed, or how it also restricted you as well. And finally, wider significance. This is the section where you think about who would be interested in your investigation, So is it the local council? Is it local government? Is it supermarkets? Is it local businesses? Is it wider government? Is it the Environment Agency? And so on. And you also consider here further research opportunities. What could you do with this next? If you were to do this again, what could you do extra that would further strengthen the investigation? Could you again do it and repeat the steps in a similar place or a different place? What else would you consider? How could you take it further? So I'm going to take you through now some examples again of an evaluation. And I've used the same NEA from the conclusions, just so there's some repetition here for you so you understand what we are looking at. So this student starts off evaluating the methodology, evaluating the data. And they talk about repetition and scale. They talk about how they could improve the reliability of the way they've repeated it. They talk about the days they collected the data. The student also talks about natural bias and picking commuters and surveying them. The student also talks about people's perceptions and the fundamental subjectivity of the data they've collected. So a lot of their data was subjective. It wasn't fact-based, and therefore there is a questionable reliability of it. The student also considers that they could have put extending descriptors in their questions and surveys so that people were more aware of what the surveys meant. The student also talks about demographic representation and how equally balanced between the age groups, for example, the people they surveyed were, and how much that represents the entire population in terms of perception. So that's kind of looking at your data and your methodology and how you collected that data. The student then, as we mentioned earlier, goes through how valid their conclusions are as a result. The student says that the house price data was particularly poor in analysis because it was not localized enough. The student says that the methods and the conclusion was generally obvious in terms of trends. The student also says that you could question the sample size and the reliability because there was only 20 people. The student also says that they could have had a larger sample size to make it more reliable, or several different types of analyses. The student also links back to their chi-squared test. They use the chi-squared test to basically say that the data was not gathered by chance and consequently increases the reliability of the survey source. In other words, they're saying that the statistical test they've carried out actually proves that the data they've collected is valid and useful in conclusions. And so what you can see here is the student throughout is questioning the reliability and questioning the validity of their conclusions and coming up with ways it was valid and was not valid. The student then moves on to further areas of investigation. And as mentioned earlier, this is where you should be thinking about how you could go further with it. So the student says there are several lines of inquiry that could be pursued. So what the student talks about then is house prices in terms of where they've collected that data. The student also talks about bias in passengers and rail passengers particularly, and how to eliminate that. The student also talks about local business owners and how they could have used them more and represented them in the investigation as another part of the socioeconomic groups they could have questioned. And the student also says the investigation should also be repeated on other cross-rail areas to see if there is trends more widely across London, or it's just these two areas where the perceptions differ. So this is how they would take the investigation further if they were to do it again. And finally, the student then considers wider contexts. So this is who might be interested in the investigation and what background information do I have that might have affected the overall investigation as well. So the student mentions, for example, the construction of HS2 being heavily criticised. The student also mentions the concerns of people in new infrastructure, and HS2 being an example of that again. And the student also mentions how complex house prices are and how that links to infrastructure development and how people might oppose infrastructure development because of house prices and where they live. So the student is considering all of the things that might impact overall or might have impacted overall the investigation in terms of people's perceptions. So that is the main bulk of your evaluation section as well. Key things to remember: make sure you are critically evaluating, you are questioning the data, you're questioning your methods, you're questioning the location, the time, the frequency, and so on. And finally, remember, for each section, you should be collecting your referencing and collating it together wherever you reference anything you have read or used from somebody else. Keep your reference list together, as that will all become one bibliography from all sections of your NEA when you have completed your evaluation. I hope this session has been useful for you in understanding the content and the structure of a conclusion and evaluation in the NEA for A-Level Geography. And thank you for listening.